A Hat in Time is fun, 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 and pretty much everything Yooka-Laylee wished it was. I don't want to rag on Yooka-Laylee too much, after all I did enjoy it as stated in my review of it. However, A Hat in Time is easily the stronger, more well-rounded title out of the two. Although both were crowdfunded at Kickstarter at roughly the same time, the extra 2 years A Hat in Time took really show through. But don't get too excited, even this game won't escape my critical eye. The premise of the game is simple. The pilot, referred to as Hat Kid, must retrieve 40 timepieces that fell from her spaceship during a little spat with an uninvited visitor. What follows is 20-something hours of collectathoning, platforming, and adventuring to find those timepieces, as well as some additional side items. In total, there are 4 areas to visit, each having an additional 2 or 3 maps that can be accessed from the inside, as well as 2 or 3 boss fights to top the area off. Hat Kid's spaceship has a telescope trained on each area and acts as a central hub that connects them all together. It's a little difficult to pin down what exactly makes A Hat in Time so magical. Even though I think it's better than most of its competitors, there are still sizable flaws that I couldn't ignore. I guess I'll sum it up as such. A Hat in Time's worst parts are still better than its competitors' best. Because I'm most familiar with Yooka-Laylee and it is still relatively fresh in my mind, I'll be using it for most of my comparisons. Starting with the story, A Hat in Time doesn't really have an overarching plot. It has stories that make use of Hat Kid when she shows up, but they aren't inherently about her. Here, the closest events that can be seen as an overarching story occur at nearly the very beginning of the game and aren't really revisited until the very end. It's a setup similar to the Kingdom Hearts series and the worlds found in those games. Each world's story is influenced by the arrival of the protagonist, but technically exists outside of them. On the flip side, Yooka-Laylee and the worlds found within it, despite being contained in books, have no story of their own. Those were just scarcely populated pieces of themed land. In fact, it's that difference in populace that makes A Hat in Time better. Yooka-Laylee populated its worlds exclusively with minions or NPCs that were directly related to those worlds' puzzles and challenges. Conversely, A Hat in Time populated its world with actual residents on top of the standard minions, NPCs, and bosses. So when you're just gazing around or exploring, the areas still feel lively. This is also aided by NPCs having actual voice lines, even if they aren't story-related dialogue. It keeps them from being relegated to simple background noise, and thanks to A+ casting, most are an absolute treasure to listen to. Speaking of voice acting, I had mentioned in my review of Fortnite Save the World just how much influence good voice acting can have on the perception of the game.
This is the kid with the hat. I hope you like my present.
Oh, that's creepy. That's actually creepy.
Your uncle's sister has come to visit you. You better show your fam some love, or I'll be talking to a corpse next time.
A Hat in Time is definitely another such example. I know I'll be replaying the game just to hear the Snatcher speak again. Although the random mumbling in Yooka-Laylee was occasionally funny, it was far from memorable. In fact, you won't lose much if you simply mute that game, but that's not the case here.
I wouldn't mind being strapped around a cute neck like yours. I would be honored to be the one who squeezes the life out of you.
The design of the game is also fairly special. It's not unique in its entirety, as there are plenty of areas and assets you would simply expect to see from the genre. You know, things like the forest area, the town area, the mountain level, the fire level. Not to mention, the blue time rift levels are all stylistically the same, differing from each other in only the most basic of measures. However, there was always something unique hidden within each of these classically themed areas. Mafia Town was a superb choice for the first world. It's a great place to learn the controls, has plenty of nooks and crannies to explore, and is hands down the best place to farm for pawns, the game's currency. Although not stylistically memorable, Mafia Town most likely has the highest number of NPCs with unique lines and personalities. After this area, you're not really required nor encouraged to talk to individual NPCs. Dead Bird Studio is the world where the game begins to deviate from the script. It's the first and technically the only world where you find yourself plopped into the middle of a story instead of one being generated around you. Additionally, unlike Mafia Town's emphasis on playful exploration, this area is more linear, more straightforward, and heavily reliant on stealth play. It's in this area that you're eventually put through 2 of my favorite levels. One is a murder mystery that takes place on a train, with the level highly stylized like film noir. Not only is the stylistic change good looking and appropriate, but is also aided by the addition of creepy crows in trench coats and their weird personal questions. Whoop.
Oh, poor express owl. You shouldn't be ashamed of your... But you'd better get your Checked out by a doctor.
Despite all that, the game still manages to keep its goofy and fun atmosphere while layering on the intrigue. Eventually, you return to the train for another level. This time, you're thrust into a fast-paced race against time in order to stop a bomb that's set off accidentally. Another area is set in a spooky swamp with an ice-laden subsection. This is where you meet the Snatcher, a black ghost that steals away your soul in exchange for some odd jobs around the house. It's also where you get to experience a genuinely unsettling ghost story that I will refrain from spoiling. In general, I'd say this area is the one that is most directly comparable to Yooka-Laylee's moody Maze Marsh. Both are set in forested swamp areas, but it's incredibly easy to tell that A Hat in Time put more effort into making its own area seem more intriguing and appealing. Even if you removed all the NPCs here, you'd still have more interesting assets to look at and more interesting land to explore. Sorry Yooka-Laylee, but that's the way it is. Lastly, there's the Alpine Skyline, a huge collection of mountain peaks that are connected by colorful cords. As far as design, I'd say that this is the most visually unique section of the game. However, it's also the most emotionally empty one, as it's filled entirely with platformer puzzles and NPCs that are only there to provide hints. Although the puzzles here are more robust and challenging, I gotta admit it was probably the least interesting section to me. However, while I was streaming the game on Twitch, there were a handful of visitors that said that they loved this place the most. In short, to each their own. Anyway, it's not like these ideas are unheard of in platformers, it's just that A Hat in Time managed to fit them all into a relatively short game without changing the genre and not becoming too burdensome or interesting for the player. This is especially true for the levels that appear to be completely different from the game's category tags on Steam. You can, however, argue that these ideas are too much of an emotional roller coaster and highlight the game's inability to keep its mind on track. In fact, considering the stylistic variations in so many sections, it wouldn't be too far-fetched to wonder if maybe this game was supposed to be something else. Personally, I see enough consistent mechanics and details that keep me from thinking it's stitched together from fragments. In fact, this is exactly what I criticized Yooka-Laylee for in my review of it. That game most definitely felt disjointed and empty of any large-scale content. However, as far as A Hat in Time goes, I can understand why some players might be unhappy with the ever-changing themes. It makes sense that you'd want to play a platformer if you set out to play a platformer, instead of suddenly switching to a murder mystery or a horror game. Although the overall pacing of the game was good, there was definitely a slight issue when considering the placements of the collectibles. Aside from the timepieces, there were 3 other collectibles that you could come across. First were the yarn balls. Collecting them revealed hat blueprints for your character, and if you had already crafted that hat, the yarn ball would be reused for another one down the line. It was very odd to keep coming across yarn balls in late game that pertained to a hat type that was created in the first world. You can't even justify it through rarity because coming across the yarn was pretty easy through simply playing the game. Since the game doesn't lock you out of levels and actively suggests you revisit worlds, I feel like the spread of this collectible can be seriously reworked. While the yarn kept the player interested in guessing what ability the next hat may give, the relic collectibles and tokens were the blandest of all. The relics are pieces of a whole artifact that sort of poked fun at the fact that Hat Kid can't really be human if she has no idea what a crayon box or a train set is. However, the relics don't actually do anything aside from serving as the glowing prize orbs to be put at the end of obstacle courses. Same thing goes for the tokens, whose only purpose was to provide the player with an opportunity to pull a new music track, a new hat skin, or a new color scheme out of the slot machine on the ship. I personally like the different color schemes and different hat styles, but this sort of thing is nothing more than filler. In Yooka-Laylee, you had to get proficient at your abilities and get through as many challenges as possible, otherwise the final boss would not trigger. In A Hat in Time, the most you can get from continuing to do platforming courses are useless yarn balls, useless relics, or maybe a chance at getting a color you like from the slot machine. Maybe, because even despite all the tokens you could possibly collect in the game, it's still not enough to empty the machine out. And that doesn't sit well with me, because it looks like the developers ran out of ways to reward the player for platforming in a platformer. Like, why include relics at all? Why include tokens at all? Why not just pick one over the other? If all tokens were switched to relics, at least the player would have an incentive to actively look for them in order to complete the artifact set. At the same time, they could limit the amount of useless yarn balls or even add another non-mandatory hat. Yooka-Laylee's challenges felt cheap for rehashing and extending the same sort of puzzles and obstacle courses over and over again. A Hat in Time felt cheap for poorly rewarding the type of playstyle it marketed itself as. And that's all without ragging on how samey the blue Time Rift levels were, because that was a dead giveaway and a lack of imagination and level creation. Lastly, the game had a very odd approach in deciding who was an important NPC from each area. There's a cat you talk to for like 10 seconds that ends up on your ship as a sort of representative of Mafia Town. Why? despite that, there's no reason to ever talk to her again. So, why? Later, a defeated boss comes back to your ship just to sell you one badge, despite there being a dedicated badge vendor written into each world. And then there's the main antagonist that builds a sort of relationship with Hat Kid but ends up unceremoniously dropped like a hot potato after you kick their butt in the finale, with no actual emotional resolution. Like, the game shows that it wants you to care about the characters you interact with, but there's just not enough there for me to give 2 cents about the Silent Goat NPCs that had no relationship with Hat Kid in the entire game. I figured this might be around the time the devs started running out of cash and were simply unable to iron out the details to the same degree as the beginning and middle of the game. Despite all that, the game is still pretty solid. The individual flaws might not sit well with some players, but there's really nothing I can think of that is embarrassingly bad or broken. I definitely recommend this game to everyone that is a fan of the genre, and those that aren't will still find this game fun. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.